Hey boys and girls, let's talk about rock. Rock and roll as a genre started in the 1950s with artists like Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, Little Richard. These artists grew up in different areas of the country, mainly in the South, but they all shared similar musical roots in blues, country, and gospel. Remember that. I'm going to circle back to that later. The genre exploded into the American public and teens fell in love. More and more musicians and groups came along and really started pushing the genre forward. Musicians like Jerry Lee Lewis, Ray Charles, Bo Diddley. Jump forward to the early 1960s. The genre gained a lot of popularity across the pond, that is to say, in England. Just like American teenagers, the youth of England loved the sound of rock and roll. Our rock and roll icons were just as influential in England as they were here in the States. And musicians tried to emulate the style and write their own rock and roll songs. It was bad. Or at least what they made wasn't exactly rock and roll. What they created was more of a revitalization of a style called skiffle. Skiffle is more like a traditional folk style of song. It was not rock and roll. What they were missing was the blues and the gospel influences. Those two genres are very much an American invention. Without that, what they had was basically just country. You ever get a hand-me-down from an older sibling, and on the outside you're like,
"Wow, thanks, that's just what I wanted."
But on the inside you know that it is exactly what you didn't want? Yeah, that's what this was, but with music. Eventually, British musicians figured out what it means to make that sweet American rock and roll. Ooh, so tasty. Young British musicians started blending the American rock and roll sound with their own local styles and created what's known as the beat boom. The style of the beat boom featured this new musical blend and upbeat melodies. This was a huge relief from the hand-me-down rock and roll that they just had. They now had a form of rock and roll they could culturally and musically identify with. They found their sound. At the forefront of the beat boom was groups such as the Yardbirds, the Kinks, the Rolling Stones, and a little-known group called the Beatles. The Beatles were a quartet of self-taught, Liverpool-born musicians that rocked the world. They were John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison. Together they started the craze known as Beatlemania. After building up their fame in England, they traveled across to America and started something people kind of ironically called the Second British Invasion. Beatlemania became widespread in America as they continued their live performances, recordings, and television appearances. After these first few years of massive success, the songwriters of the group, Lennon and McCartney, decided they wanted to experiment and push their sound a little bit further. The record started becoming more subtle and nuanced, giving more for the listener to take in and experience. In addition to their normal songs, the Beatles started pushing out tracks that were experiments in sound recording and pushed the norm with their soundscapes. In the following years, the Beatles decided to take a break from the public eye, and they started focusing more on the recording studio. This was a time of huge growth and evolution for them. They released some high-quality records that really showed off the group's unrestrained genius. They solidified their place as the voice of a new countercultural movement. Also during this time, they traveled to India and studied with gurus in an effort to broaden their musical horizons, experiment and push the sound further, and expand their minds with meditation and spiritual exercises. These influences are clearly heard in songs such as Norwegian Wood, where you can hear a traditional Indian instrument called a sitar. After this time in the studio, they continued for a few years recording and performing, though they were no longer really at the forefront of counterculture. But they're still very popular and kept very good record sales. Sadly though, in 1970, the group officially broke up. They all went their separate ways, though they all were still recording music on their own. Now, the Beatles are a unique group Even though they haven't been together since 1970, they are still an immensely popular band. Their music seems to transcend time. And what I mean by that is, even though the times changed, people changed, values changed, music taste and culture changed, the Beatles still remained relevant. They still were an important part of society. The band as a group was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988, and they each individually got their own induction in later years. This was the Beatles, Beatlemania. This was the second British invasion, though it was less of an aggressive takeover and more of a cultural phenomenon. We can talk more about British invaders later, but for now, that's it. Thank you, boys and girls. I hope you have a good day. I'll see you later.